Thank you, Stephen. I'm now going to bring in our special guest, Lena Simet, who is a senior researcher and advocate on poverty and inequality at Human Rights Watch. Thank you, Lena, for being with us and for listening to all of that and looking through the data yourself earlier, I know. Lena's research focuses on social protection, labour rights and non-standard forms of employment like the app-based gig economy, and how austerity-driven budget cuts and the privatisation of basic essential services can undermine human rights. So given those specialties, Lena, welcome. I'm wondering, when you looked through this year's data, what has stood out for you?
Thank you so much, Talia. And just to say that I'm really excited to be here today, and it's been a really wonderful webinar. Looking through the data, I think, it showed very clearly that there's so much room for improvement, especially in regards to poverty and inequality indicators, which are the ones that I mainly looked at. Which almost suggests that we're sort of in a crisis moment regarding social and economic rights, where in 2021, nearly 10% of the global population was living in extreme poverty. And those are data from the World Bank using a very low, in my opinion, too low of a threshold of $1.90 a day. So we're looking at the Hermi data on poverty, which is a sub category of the work score. I noticed that not only are scores quite low in many countries, but also some countries have deteriorated over time. So I compared the 2019 data to the 2007 data and noticed that more than 30 countries, in fact, dropped in their score. So are performing worse now than they had in the past in terms of poverty. And I was also looking at the food score, since I'm currently working on food security issues, and also noticed that nearly 20 countries had declining scores in food, which relates to food security and food access. So these are quite concerning numbers that we noticed that even before the pandemic, scores were quite low and deteriorating. So again, this calls for greater investments and more improvements from the government side in these aspects.
And so how do those scores resonate with what you see in your own research at Human Rights Watch?
Unfortunately, they resonate quite well. So these are trends that we are seeing repeatedly in our work, and that we have seen deteriorate further during the pandemic, where poverty as well as hunger and food insecurity have risen. And although some countries, and similar to what Stephen just described, have introduced new systems to protect people from economic insecurity, many are highly inadequate, right? And that was the case already before the pandemic, where social protection systems are highly exclusionary, so they often exclude informal workers, or they have certain conditionalities that make it incredibly difficult for people to access support. And here I think there's a very clear link to social and political rights that would require citizenship cards. For instance, that's the case in Nepal, where people without citizenship cards are excluded from all sorts of public services and social security. And that then leads to data such as 4 billion people currently not covered by any form of social protection. That's data by the ILO.
So many of us hoped, and Stephen was talking about this, that we hoped that at the start of the pandemic that government responses might actually lead to improvements in some rights. But as Stephen said, that's not actually what we observed in our data. What about in your research?
Yeah, unfortunately, very, very similar findings. We had hopes at the beginning, since there was quite some attention paid to the inequalities that were inherent in the health sector, also in economic terms. And we've seen these quite dramatic expansions of safety nets, I have to say, where there was a very different response in 2020 compared to 2008 after the financial crisis. So this gave some hope that this time things would be different. However, we again quickly saw falling back into very very well-known approaches where expansions were short-lived, highly temporary, continued to exclude certain populations, including informal workers, etc. But also that we are already now seeing sort of a new wave of austerity, right? Which is again something we had seen post 2008, and I think what we are seeing now is in fact an even worse situation where there's a global food crisis on the way, which in part is due to the pandemic, but also due to the war in Ukraine, which has sort of reinforcing quite negative trends.
So, Hermie, we're a data producer. We're not advocates ourselves. So it's great to be talking with you, as Human Rights Watch is, of course, a key advocacy organisation globally. So I'm wondering, how do governments react when you advocate for more investment in economic and social rights? And I'm also interested, how do you see that Hermie data can be useful in discussions about budget allocations and what's achievable in countries?
Yeah, one of the most common things we hear from governments as we push for more investments in economic and social rights is the lack of resources. And, you know, that certain countries at very limited budget lines or in low-income countries simply don't have the resources needed to invest in education and healthcare systems. And this is, I think, where the Hermie data is so powerful. Not that we're not comparing Nepal to France, but we're in fact comparing countries at similar income levels to demonstrate, hold on, you know, this can be achieved, and in fact has been achieved by some of your peers. And for us, this is also useful since we're often perceived as sort of a naming and shaming organization, pointing out only the flaws. But by using this data, I think we can also encourage governments to learn from one another, right? So why is it that this other country has made these huge achievements and has achieved this better score? So how do we learn from them, right? Rather than finger pointing and the low results. But I think, you know, when we talk about the progressive realization of rights, we also try to communicate to countries that they need to expand, so make progress and achievements quickly, and they need to gather the revenue to do so, right? And so they can simply say, well, you know, we have low resources, low revenues. This is simply our limit, but in fact, push them to expand their budget, to expand their fiscal boundaries, to further invest in economic and social rights.
So what's your message? We're coming to the end of our time together. So let's have a call to action. What is your message to governments and decision makers? Where are we up to now, and where do we need to be?
So governments, in our view, need to fully commit to economic and social rights. And the failure to do so will lead to immense suffering in the coming years. So that includes more people in poverty. It also includes social unrest and protests, as we're already witnessing in several countries, including in Ecuador, Lebanon, Kazakhstan, so really across different regions. And many of these protests are in response to economic policies and the dire economic situations that we are seeing. So, and we also have to acknowledge, of course, that we are in difficult economic terms now, with rising debt levels that have been accumulated during the pandemic and economic recessions in several places, as well as pressures from international financial institutions such as the World Bank or the IMF to cut spending and introduce austerity measures that cut spending to services essential to economic and social rights. So I'm saying this because I think I would have two main messages for governments: that even though we are in this difficult economic situations, there are alternatives to austerity measures. And austerity, as we have researched it in the past, is in most circumstances quite harmful to human rights. But it is not inevitable, right? So there are alternatives such as increasing tax revenue. So basically increasing the pie rather than simply cutting out certain aspects that are then harmful to rights. And the other aspect also, simply to highlight that we're not talking about pure expenses, right? But investing in social and economic rights is in fact a very positive and economically speaking, an advancing way of progressing a country. And so we therefore advocate for more counter-cyclical fiscal measures, which are good for growth, but also good for rights. So this means as economies are struggling, investing more in social economic rights rather than cutting back.
Thank you so much for your time and your expertise, Lena, for joining us. We look forward to continued partnership in the human rights revolution. Thank you everybody for joining us today, for everybody who's been listening and everybody who's been contributing, presenting. Now, whatever kind of use anyone might have for our data, we are here to help. We at Hermi really enjoy helping people understand our data and figure out how to use it in your own work. So please get in touch with me if you have any questions. My email address will be in the chat box, and you can all just contact me directly if there's any way that we can help. We also have several workshops recorded on our YouTube channel in different languages. Please make use of those resources. We are now at the end of our time together. So let me just remind you that you can keep up with our work anytime by following us on social media and signing up for occasional email newsletters. The details have been in the chat box. You might want to go and copy them before the webinar closes. And you can always just find us online. We're pretty easy to Google. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, joining us in this human rights revolution that we are all working towards to make the world better, kinder, and fairer. I hope you all have a wonderful day and evening and week, and we look forward to partnering with you in the future. Thanks, everybody.